Today's lecture is about the nervous system and drug addiction. We'll use this opportunity to have an overview of the nervous system, which includes the nerves themselves, known as neurons, synapses, and neurotransmitters. We'll talk about how those nerves can interface with muscles to cause movement. And when that doesn't go right, it can result in paralysis. Our discussion of paralysis will help to understand how it is that nerves and muscles interface together. Then we'll transition to drug addiction. We will talk about how the nervous system plays a role in addiction. But first, let's overview the nervous system itself. This is a nerve cell. I use the word nerve cell and neuron interchangeably, so don't be confused with that. The dendrite is the larger part here with the cell body and the nucleus. Then you have an axon that will extend from the dendrite and have little connecting points at the end there. These end connections of the axon usually interface with other parts of different nerve cells to create a network of nerves. And so the nerve impulse is carried away from the dendrite through the axon and into other nerve cells. We have three types of nerve cells that are described or named for their descriptions. The first would be the sensory neurons, and just as you might think, these sensory neurons are specialized neurons that react to various senses, the ones that we're most familiar with, of course, being things like seeing, sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Specialized nerve cells will respond to those different aspects of that sensory input and carry that information along the network of neurons toward the brain. The interneurons are intermediate neurons. They are found in the spinal column in the brain and are responsible for transmission and connections resulting in sort of the storage of information. Then motor neurons finally are neurons that interface with the muscles. These neurons will respond to impulses from the interneurons to cause a muscle to contract in a particular way. So I've been saying nerve impulse. Well, what I mean by that is specifically an electrochemical change that will cause a relay of an action of information from one nerve cell to another. And as said earlier, it tends to move from the dendrite through the axon and into another nerve cell where this process is continued, sort of like a line of dominoes that may fall down. Often we will use analogies to describe different systems, like the nervous system. We might say that these electrochemical impulses, these nerve impulses, might be like electricity moving along wires from one to another. But that particular analogy somewhat breaks down because with electricity requires a tight connection. If you have a bad connection, then the light bulb may not light up or something along those lines. But in nerve cells, there is a space between each nerve cell. And that space is called a synapse. And so if you'll see in the picture to the top right, a close up view of one of these axon terminals, just the end of one of the axons, will show that it doesn't directly touch the dendrite. There's a little space there. That space is called the synapse. So in order for the nerve impulse to come down the axon and actually transmit across to the other nerve cell to the dendrite and continue, requires something called a neurotransmitter. And these neurotransmitters are little molecules that exist in this space, in this synapse, and they will move from the axon to receptor sites that are on the other side on the dendrite. And when they do that, they effectively relay that information and trigger a continued movement along the dendrite, and the process continues. Now, while there are 100 or so known neurotransmitters, we're only going to look at a few of them. Dopamine is probably the most familiar after your reading. We'll talk next about acetylcholine, though, because that is a good explanation for a number of different aspects of the nervous system. And I mentioned serotonin because many of you have heard of it. When a neurotransmitter is released from the axon and crosses the synapse to the receptor site on the dendrite, that nerve impulse is said to propagate. It moves from one neuron to the next. But imagine if you want to have another nerve impulse after that. You have to have a place. You have to have an open receptor site on the dendrite in order for another neurotransmitter to go from the axon to the dendrite. You don't want these nerve cells to be like single use. So in order to free up that place, that receptor site, you have to have an enzyme that will degrade or break down the neurotransmitter. So all of the neurotransmitters have a corresponding enzyme to break them down. In the case of acetylcholine, that is a neurotransmitter that will be released from axon to dendrite that will result in muscle contractions. Well, in order to have further subsequent muscle contractions, you have to break down the acetylcholine. An enzyme called acetylcholinesterase is responsible for breaking down acetylcholine and thus freeing up the receptor site on the dendrite. Movement occurs because muscles contract, muscles that are connected to the bones of the skeletal system. Those particular muscles that connect to bones are called skeletal muscles. These skeletal muscles result in movement because when they contract, they're pulling the bones into different positions. Now, muscles always pull when they contract. They never push. They can never lengthen. Muscles can only shorten. That's what contraction results in. So in the case of your bicep, that particular muscle may shorten, and when it does that, it's going to pull the forearm closer because it's connected to this bone here, the radius. Now, if you want to straighten the arm back out, you have to have a separate muscle, the triceps, that comes around behind the elbow here and attaches there, and when it contracts, when the triceps contract, it will straighten the arm out. So these muscles that work in opposite directions from each other are called antagonistic muscles. Most muscles that result in movement in your body are found in pairs, what we call antagonistic pairs, so that you can have movement in both directions. In order to have the various types of movement that we have in our body, you must have many, many different types of muscles. And these are only a few of them seen from the front, and here's some more seen from the back. Now, you're not responsible for knowing the names of these muscles, but the reason there are so many is because all these muscles can only move the bones in one particular direction. So if you wanted to move an arm up, you have to have a separate one to move it down. If you want to move your head to the left, you have a separate one to move it to the right, and on and on. I'll also point out that many of these names, while they may look somewhat foreign to you because they're in Latin, you might recognize the abbreviations. So gluteus maximus is often referred to as just the glutes. Trapezius, your traps, etc. Now, in order for these skeletal muscles to actually contract in the first place and result in any kind of movement, there has to be an impulse received from a motor neuron. Remember, motor neurons will relay signals from the interneurons, which usually are in response to something been received from a sensory neuron before that. When that nerve impulse reaches the end of the line from the motor neuron, it actually connects to muscle fibers. So the end of the motor neuron interfaces to a muscle bundle, these muscle fibers. And when that happens, in much the way that a nerve impulse causes each of the connected nerve cells to react and have a movement of that nerve impulse, when that nerve impulse reaches the muscle bundle, it causes those muscles to then begin to contract. So just like we had a synapse between different nerve cells, the space between the axons, so this is the axon looking like a bulb here coming out from the top here, that axon does not actually directly touch the the muscle cells in this case, but instead there's a space. Now, because the space is between a nerve cell, the axon, and a muscle bundle, We call that the neuromuscular junction. So the neuromuscular junction is functionally the same as a synapse, except that it's between a nerve cell and a muscle. In the same way, though, you have neurotransmitters that will be released from the axon into the neuromuscular junction. In this case, we're talking about acetylcholine, because acetylcholine is responsible for these muscles moving. You have the acetylcholine bonding to receptor sites in the muscle, and when that happens, the muscles shorten. These muscle fibers will move towards each other and result in a shortening of the distance between these separate fibers. And the sum movement of all those millions and millions of little fibers will cause the entire muscle bundle to shorten significantly and result in movement. So when your biceps move, you have millions of these little fibers all coming closer together, shortening the distance from one insertion point to the other, and it moves the bones along with it. Remember that muscles can only shorten, which means that they can only pull on the bones, never push. Now, there are a variety of things that can cause this system to not work properly. And in many of those cases, it will result in paralysis, which simply means the inability to move that muscle. One of the easiest to understand would be if there's physical damage to a nerve. In the case where there's physical damage to a nerve, the nerve impulse may be coming from the dendrite through the axon, and it may be interrupted. It may never make it to its destination because it has been physically broken. Think like a spinal cord injury. These types of interruptions in the nerve impulse will prevent the muscle from contracting and result in paralysis. Specifically, in the case of ALS, sometimes referred to as Lou Gehrig disease, these nerve cells prevent your muscles from moving because what's happening there is that the motor neurons progressively break down. And so you get fewer and fewer connections between muscles and nerve cells. So the nerve cells are not accurately determining how your muscles can move. So first you have weakness, and then the inability to control the movement, and then eventually the ability to move is usually lost altogether. Other things can cause paralysis, not just physical damage or disease. The introduction of a contaminant toxin such as nerve gas, most famous being sarin gas that you've perhaps heard about in news stories being released into subways and that type of thing. This type of nerve gas will actually prevent the neurotransmitters from being cleaned up. So as you'll recall, in order for future nerve impulses to take place, that neurotransmitter must be broken down. It must be removed. If something is preventing that neurotransmitter from being broken down, then future neurotransmitters can't find a space to bond. There's no open receptor sites, and so no movement will occur. This is what happens with nerve gas. In the case of acetylcholine, it will bond. That very first time there will be a reaction, there will be a movement, but then the acetylcholine stays bound up in that receptor site, preventing other neurotransmitters of acetylcholine from being able to bond and cause a repeat movement. This is because cholinesterase is being inhibited by the nerve gas, and so there's nothing there to break down acetylcholine. You also have the case, a different type of toxin, this one caused by a bacterial infection. Tetanus is what results when your antagonistic muscles contract at the same time. This is a case where the exposure to this toxin causes an involuntary release of acetylcholine and causes the muscles to all move without being directed to do so by the motor neurons. So you're losing the control of these muscles. You're not able to tell your muscles whether to contract or not. They are contracting involuntarily, and they're all doing it at the same time. So if you've ever had a muscle cramp like a Charlie horse, you know how painful that can be. Imagine that taking place in all your muscles at once, and it's quite a serious thing when that happens. And that is the case of tetanus toxin. You also can have something a little different, botulism toxin. Again, we're talking about a toxin released by bacteria, this one botulism. In this case, rather than the acetylcholine being released indiscriminately, like in the case of tetanus, here the acetylcholine is being blocked. So there is no release of acetylcholine. That nerve impulse reaches the end of the line at the end of the motor neuron, and instead of acetylcholine being released from the axon of that motor neuron, crossing the neuromuscular junction and binding to the receptor site on the muscle fibers, instead of that, the acetylcholine is not released. And when it's not released, the muscles never receive word to contract. It results in paralysis. Those muscles just don't contract. Now, we've learned how to harness the power of this in small doses. Botulism toxin can be injected into targeted areas, usually around the fine little muscles around the face, causing those muscles to relax. Now, we rebranded it, called it Botox, because no one would pay a lot of money to have botulism toxin injected into them. But Botox, that's something you pay for. When Botox is injected into those little lines, we sometimes call them crow's feet or other wrinkles in that area. The reason they're wrinkled is because muscles just under the skin are contracting and pulling the skin with them into a wrinkle. And so if you can paralyze those muscles, they will stay slack, and the wrinkle will disappear. Now, too much of this can result in an artificial sort of immobility of the face, and your face may not look like it moves quite as much. You can create kind of a mask-like appearance if there's too much Botox injected. It also does not last forever. It usually lasts for weeks or months, and so reapplications are necessary for it. And there is some potential for damage if this Botox were to spread beyond just the surface area of the muscles and affect other muscles in your body. While rare, that could potentially be severe. Let's transition to drugs and the idea of drug addiction. I'm not going to lecture you about how drugs cause all the problems of the world, but there is certainly a price to drug addiction. Many of you have probably experienced that with family, loved ones, friends, something like that. And there's a lot of various things that can happen, some of those very bad, diseases, death, a variety of things like that, but also social problems. And most recently, we've been hearing a lot about this opioid epidemic. Well, to be clear, opioids are a category of drugs, typically pain relievers of some kind, that you've heard of some of these, certainly probably heroin, codeine, maybe oxycodone. OxyContin is a particular one, hydrocodone. Fentanyl. Many famous people have dealt with the addiction to these because they are very, very addictive, and unfortunately, several have died from it as well. The cases of opioid addictions are increasing dramatically recently, in large part because these medications are legal, and while they may be difficult to obtain, they are easier than many illicit drugs, illegal drugs. And so as a result, many people are finding themselves addicted to these opioids. You can see 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses the previous 15 or so years. It's a real problem. So why is this affecting so many people? Why is it that they don't just stop? Why do people get addicted to a drug, for example? It turns out that there's a very good reason for it, and it very much is like fighting against instinct, because dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for addiction, but it's also one of our most important neurotransmitters. So why would we need something like that? Well, it turns out that without dopamine, and remember, what happens with dopamine is when it's released into the brain in a particular way, it creates a feeling of pleasure, extreme pleasure. Now you might think, why would humans need such a system, which we call the reward pathway? Why would you need to be rewarded? Well, it turns out that many of the things that are most important for the survival of the human species, or in fact any living species, are not things that you might want to just go out and do. For example, eating. Now, today, of course, we have it easy. If you're hungry, you just go out and eat something. That hasn't always been the case. If you had to go out and hunt, if you had to go out and gather plants to eat, what if that plant's toxic? What if you get injured hunting an animal? Or what if another human attacks you while you're out and about doing either? It's a risk to go out and eat. So it might be that people might be inclined to not want to do something like that, to sort of play it safe, if you will. But that'd be very bad for them because, of course, without food, remember, you would not have a source of glucose, which is necessary for cellular respiration and produce ATP, and you would die. So in order to motivate a person to do that, eating creates a great feeling of pleasure. And in fact, the opposite occurs when you're hungry. You can start to feel pretty bad. Many people have experienced, myself included, when I get hungry, I do start to feel pretty bad. I'm agitated. I can't think about much anything except getting food. And that's because our body's reward pathway is compelling us to go out and eat because we need to eat. Other things we need to do include sex. Now, you may not think of sex as a necessary thing, but as a species, as a population, without sex, the species would become extinct after one generation. And why else would anyone engage in sex if it weren't for the fact that it feels good? Because then it would just be awkward and messy. But as it is, sex does feel good. People are compelled to engage in it, and it does further our species. So both of these things, sex and eating, feel good and compel us to do that because dopamine is being released into our brain. Now, just like other neurotransmitters, remember dopamine is a neurotransmitter, just like other neurotransmitters, dopamine must be reabsorbed. It must be broken down. And there is a separate enzyme called monoamine oxidase, abbreviated MAO, that will break down dopamine. I think of MAO as sort of the buzzkill enzyme because dopamine makes you feel good, but MAO is going to break it down. You don't have too much of a good thing here. But of course, the idea is that you have to have those receptor sites available so that you can have a future release of dopamine and thus feel good again. Well, addictive drugs haven't always been present throughout all of human evolution. Certainly situations like the necessity to eat and reproduce have. And so those were very good reasons to be compelled to do them. But drugs circumvent this normal sort of working of the reward pathway. They release that same, and in fact sometimes even more intense feelings of pleasure by releasing dopamine into the nucleus accumbens of the brain. But there's no associated health benefit with it. You don't get energy like you do with eating. You don't potentially reproduce like you do with sex. In the case of drugs, it's just an immediate release of pleasure. Now, different drugs will affect the way that dopamine works in different ways. So there's 3 drugs here that are just examples of the sort of categories or ways that this can occur. Cocaine, for example, will block the absorption of dopamine. What that means is that the dopamine stays in the receptor sites longer. What it's doing is inhibiting MAO. As a result of inhibiting that MAO, the dopamine stays in those receptor sites a little longer, you feel good a little longer. Amphetamines work differently. Instead of working on the receptor sites, instead of preventing the breakdown of dopamine, they in fact increase the release of dopamine from the axon. So you get an increase in dopamine in the synapse, in this case specifically with the reward pathway. This space is called the nucleus accumbens. It's in the brain. And when that dopamine is released into that area, you feel very good. So amphetamines are increasing the amount of dopamine overall. So all those receptor sites are full and you feel good. Now, nicotine works in a sense in both ways. You get an increase in dopamine just like you did with amphetamines, and you have the inhibition of MAO just like you did with cocaine. So from both sides, it's resulting in more dopamine being bonded with more receptor sites and staying there longer. It's thought this is probably one of the reasons cigarettes are notoriously difficult to stop smoking. Nicotine is quite addictive because it's acting upon the dopamine system in both ways here. Now, physiologically, what's happening with addiction is that the dopamine system is being affected in one of those 3 ways, as illustrated before. and the receptor sites in your brain are becoming full of dopamine. It's overwhelming the ability to receive all of them, and you get this feeling of high that lasts for a while. But what can happen eventually is that as you do this over and over again, the corresponding rebound after the dopamine is removed and does go away from these receptor sites becomes progressively worse, and it takes more of the drug to get more of the dopamine in there to feel good again. Now, over time, instead of creating a high, you're really just needing the drugs just to get back to a kind of normal feeling, because the absence of the dopamine is bringing you down so low. And so this creates a kind of vicious cycle here, where at first the drug use left you feeling good, but over repeated time, you would feel less and less good each time and need more and more of the drug just to get back to a baseline. So many heavily addicted people find themselves having to use large amounts of a particular drug just to not feel terrible, just to get back to some kind of sense of normalcy. And this can eventually cause real problems for the body, because in high enough concentrations, many of these drugs can be very dangerous. Now, people can stop taking these drugs. Now, this isn't going to be easy, because your body remembers what it felt like to have these drugs in your system. And as an evolutionary adaptation, you learned that when you did this certain action, take this drug, for example, you had this strong dopamine release that felt so good. So relapse and addiction operates on the very same systems that are associated with learning and memory. You can't unlearn things once you've learned them. It's there. And once your body has experienced what happens when you take these drugs, the result of this dopamine release, you're not going to be able to just somehow forget that. Your body's not going to let you forget that, because as far as your body knows, throughout all the course of human evolution, dopamine release was associated with something good and beneficial. Only with the introduction of these drugs do we see a system where the dopamine release is connected to something that's not good for you. For that reason, scientists now understand that drug addiction is not a weakness. It's not some flaw in a person's character where they just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and change what they're doing. While there certainly does need to be action by the individual, we know that it's fighting in a way against nature and instinct, because that person that has experienced the effects of the drug are having to fight against a very difficult instinctive part of their body that is quite compelling. It's not the sort of logical higher level thinking. It's the deep sort of dinosaur level primitive survival part of the brain that's saying dopamine good. Do whatever you have to get the dopamine. And if that involves shooting up with a drug or whatever the case may be, then your body will compel you to do that. Thinking, perhaps misguidedly so, but on that primitive level, your brain knows no different, that this would be, in fact, something beneficial. We also know from studies and things that there does seem to be some propensity or prevalence of drug addiction running in families. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that if a close family member is a drug addict that you will be. But what it does mean is that there may be some genetic component to susceptibility of addiction, or the types of things that make addiction a risk. And from an evolutionary standpoint, those wouldn't necessarily be things that you automatically associate as weaknesses or flaws, but instead could still make you susceptible to addiction. Now, the ideal would be if there was some way to counteract the effect of these drugs. And there are some drugs that will somewhat counter the effect of drugs. They make certain drugs less appealing, and that can help a drug user to get off of the drug. Usually this has to be done in a slow and calculated way so there's not extreme withdrawal. but it is something that is seen as now a treatable thing, that this is more of a medical condition that, of course, does have serious consequences as well. Now, there are a variety of ways to tell if you're substance dependent. These are things you can look at on your own, but run through this list and see if if any of these, apply to you. If a variety of them do, then you may need to take a look at whether or not you might have a problem being addicted to a certain drug. The sooner you stop that addiction and deal with it and begin to try to get off that drug, the more likely you are to have long-term success. Briefly, we'll take a look at one particular drug, methamphetamine, that's seen by many as being one of the major problems in the drug world these days, probably because it is so easy to produce and obtain and relatively inexpensive. Most people make the drug themselves, but at grave risk to themselves because it's a dangerous thing, because it is highly flammable, and so many times the people making these drugs find themselves injured or burned. By some estimates, nearly half of the residents in burn units across the country are there as a result of meth labs that have caught fire. It's a very dangerous thing. It's also very hard on your body and your brain. As mentioned earlier, methamphetamine, as a general class of amphetamines, causes an increased release of amphetamine. So you are overwhelming the receptor sites in your brain. And when this happens, it accelerates, in many ways, sort of like the aging process. That's not literally what's happening, but you're running your body hard here. And there are many pretty serious consequences of people taking meth. Not to just overly scare people, but nonetheless, it's not without consequence to do certain drugs, some more than others. Also should point out that in nearly all cases, when you stop taking a drug, the receptor cells in your brain are not permanently damaged. They do go back to a sort of normal state. However, you will still remember what prompted you to have that release of dopamine in the first place. And that's where relapse comes in. Not because your brain and those receptor sites are physically damaged, but because your brain has learned, it has remembered how you obtain that feeling of pleasure, what you have to do to get that dopamine release. So even though after abstinence for a while, your brain may revert back to the same situation it was in prior to drug use, because you will know what you did to get that dopamine release, you will always be susceptible to relapse.